So I'm going to talk about something that has become a catchphrase, if you like, in procurement. And game theory, the frequency in which I see it cropping up is increasing and increasing. And when you delve into how it's analyzed and commonly understood now by people working in procurement, it's not really reflective of what game theory is all about. And so I want to try and elaborate on why it is still important and why it will become increasingly important in a world with automation, but in different ways in which it's applied at present. So first of all, I'll just start from a point where I'll assume you don't know anything about game theory. So I'm just going to start with a very, very quick primer. So what is game theory? It's the science of strategic interaction. So if you look at anything from negotiations to even it may not be commercial negotiations, it may be Brexit negotiations or trade negotiations or any type of negotiations. You can have two players across the table from one another, and they may have conflicting objectives, or there may be potentially win-win outcomes. Now, how you structure those negotiations, how you share information, the process you engage in can influence whether the outcomes are successful for all or a complete failure. And if you don't understand game theory and how certain outcomes are possible, then you can lead to big problems. So, for example, if you commence a process that's starting to look like a game of chicken, it's going to lead to a potentially chaotic outcome and a worst-case outcome for everybody. So you can see how trade negotiations become negotiations that evolve into a game of chicken very quickly. So anybody who knows their game theory knows to never initiate games of that type. In sourcing, though, so I want to keep things kind of tied back to the main theme of today and why this is important to sourcing. The players in this game and how game theory is applied in the context of what we do, the players are the suppliers, and the buying organization is setting up the game for those suppliers who you expect to act strategically. So procurement's challenge is a mechanism design challenge. It's actually what we refer to as inverse game theory. You're setting up the rules of the game so that given your assumption about how your suppliers are self-interested profit maximizers, right? That's what game theory assumes, that they're rational decision makers, they're self-interested, and if any decision benefits them, even if it harms others, that's the decision they're going to make. So game theory is a mathematical model for giving you a picture of what likely outcomes will be if you set the game up in a certain way. But it may tell you that this is a bad game, or you may offer it another game and it would say, yeah, this might lead to a good outcome. But game theory on its own doesn't tell you what's the best mechanism to actually use. And there's an infinite set of mechanisms. So which mechanism should I choose? I don't want to be told just that this one mechanism out of the millions I could apply is bad. And I want something more useful. So sourcing automation needs more than just game theory. It needs mechanism design. And because you're in a world of automated bots negotiating, you actually need what's known as algorithmic mechanism design. So it's computers searching for the best mechanism in advance of any negotiation so that you can apply in expectation, because this is always in expectation. You're establishing probability distributions in terms of how your suppliers will act in certain circumstances. It's a world of imperfect information, but you can still improve those probability distributions and learn over time what your expected payoff structures for your suppliers look like. So that's the first thing, and it's never mentioned, and it's 9 out of 10 articles you'll read on game theory for procurement never even mention mechanism design, and they're looking at the wrong thing. to get towards mechanism design, you do need to start with game theory because it is the foundation for, it's the approach that's used to analyze how, what we call agents, or self-interested agents act. Now, going to use this example to illustrate I used to teach game theory in university, so we used to get, I won't do it now, it takes a little bit of time. I used to get students to stand up, right, and say, you're a role player and you're the column player. And the way this works is, if I'm the role player and Jakob is the column player, and if I choose up and he chooses left, so he might write down left on a piece of paper, not show anyone, and I'm writing down up, not telling anyone. We reveal them at the same time. It's like a game of rock, paper, scissors. I get 60, he gets 55. Then you play the game again. And I see that actually he chose left. If I'd chosen right, I would have gotten 90. He would have got 40, but I would have gotten 90. So if you're a myopic learning agent, and you're not very good at this game, but you kind of learn as you've got a simple algorithm, which is always make a move that improves from what your last situation was. You'd actually you'd be short-sighted, and you'd say, okay, I'm gonna jump to let me see. No, if I was choosing up and he was choosing left, I should have chosen down because I would have got 70. So 70 would have been my payoff. The row player is getting the first number, column player is getting the second number. So that's how agents can learn in a game theoretic sense, but that doesn't always take the agents towards a Nash equilibrium that always maximizes the individual's payoff or even the sum of the payoffs. In some kinds of games, like Prisoner's Dilemma, it's a famous type of game. What happens is selfish utility maximizers end up harming each other because it's a game of conflict. So if the rules of game are set up so that if you don't work or cooperate with the other players, you both lose. So you have to analyze each game in turn to see what's the payoff structure like, what would the other player choose if I choose this, and what would they choose knowing that if I was to choose this. So you have this kind of iterative loop of reasoning where they know I'm going to choose that if they choose that, and it iterates infinitely, right? So in this game, what you do to calculate what we call the Nash equilibrium, or try and predict what the outcome would be, is you look at, is there any strategy either of the players wouldn't ever use? And the column player, so Jakob would be looking at his payoff options and seeing, if I choose right, I get 40, 15, or 50. Now, irrespective of whether I choose up, center, or down, I'd get 55, 50, or 75. So left dominates right. So you'd never choose right. Now, so you delete that strategy. That'll never be applied. Is there anything else we can rule out? But now we've reduced the game, so maybe there's another strategy that could be dominated. And if you look at the up strategy for me, 60 or 30 if I choose up, whereas if I choose down, it'll be 70 or 40. So irrespective of whether Jakob chooses left or right, down is always going to dominate up. So we've now reduced the game down to a set of strategies that are more likely, but can we keep going? So we can keep going and keep going, and then we get down to what we call a dominant strategy Nash equilibrium. So there's one solution in this game, and John Nash's famous result was that there's always at least one Nash equilibrium in any game. So you could have thousands of available strategies. You could have thousands of players in multi-dimensional games. There's always one Nash equilibrium in which players have chosen a strategy and they'll never want to deviate because any other strategy will lead to a lower payoff in expectation.
And do I understand it correctly, you say that there would always be a Nash equilibrium in any game? So for example, a Dutch auction, that would be a Bayesian
Yes.
game instead. That doesn't have a Nash equilibrium.
It does have a Nash, but it's what we call a a mixed strategy Nash equilibrium, where agents randomize. So the Nash equilibrium doesn't say player A is always going to play this strategy and player B is always going to play this strategy. Instead, what it says, a mixed strategy Nash equilibrium, and this is an example, it's a game of chicken, right? So this is an example of a game where you look at the payoffs for, I say, I'm looking at compromise 0 or -1. I'm looking at don't compromise 1 or -10. Neither of those dominate each other, because depending on what my opponent chooses, I could be better playing one strategy over another. So this is a game of chicken, and it is a little like it's a game of conflict, where game theorists, when they see a payoff structure like this in a game, and they know that the outcome will be quite chaotic because it's going to be randomized. So even in some of the biggest negotiations that go on at a macro level, it's the EU and Britain are playing a high stakes game of chicken. So it was clear, it would be clear to any game theorist from the very outset of that Brexit decision that the Nash equilibrium in that game meant that you have players have a choice, compromise or don't compromise. Then you have the asymmetry between one larger player and one smaller player. So what you get is agents that try to change the perception of their payoff structure to the other. So you'd have the EU putting up a blanket defense of no compromise, we're far too big, we're not even going to consider it, we're not even going to meet to discuss it. So, and Britain, where their best strategy would be to feign a degree of craziness, right? Because they want their opponent to think, we're going to go all out in this, we're up for leave with no deal, right? So they got themselves into a situation. It wouldn't have been their strategy before the referendum, but once they got to a position where they realized this is a game of chicken, we've got to look like we're prepared to do anything, and they kept with that position. So that was actually a predictable process, a predictably chaotic process. So game theory is this. It's a way of mathematically modeling the likely outcomes in a wide range of situations.
Alan, can I ask you a quick question on that one? Creating a perception that they're willing to leave with an idea, for example, doesn't that only work if the other side sees that eventuality as being worse for them than it would be? Doesn't it all fall apart?
So when there's transparency, it falls apart. So that was kind of why it all starts to appear so ludicrous. Because if it was one business talking to another business, and there wasn't articles being published in newspapers and news items on the BBC, and everyone could see a degree of their strategy within their negotiations, that may be a more credible threat. So the credibility in those threats falls apart when it's a government situation where there's a degree of transparency and there's leaks left, right, and centre. So but in a business-to-business environment, you can start to feign credibility, and we see that in pricing, in negotiations with suppliers, where a company may be saying, "We're going to leave you. We're going to move over to another supplier," and they have no intention of doing it, and the incumbent is saying, "But there'll be all this damage." Well, you have an incentive as a procurement team to feign a degree of irrationality or a misunderstanding of the true costs of making that change, so that your negotiating position is strengthened. So that's game theory in use, and it's game theory in use by people who may never have read any article or textbook on game theory. It's intuitive. It's strategizing. It's what every football team does and applies on a day-to-day basis, but they may never have heard of game theory. So game theory is this kind of mathematical model for setting up for understanding behaviors or being able to predict likely behaviors in different settings.
Alan, just a quick one as well. In terms of the implication for sourcing, are you saying in terms of the selection of option type, or the number of suppliers selected, or is that what you're implying in terms of how does it relate then to how you've changed in terms of designing the auction?
So, the mechanisms in sourcing are a set of rules for the types of information your suppliers see during a negotiation process. So their behaviours will change depending upon. There's three things in the mechanism. There's the allocation rule. It's how you're going to award that business. What's your? Are you going to give it to the highest bidder, or are you going to have trade-offs? Or are you going to have more advanced scenarios where you have rules about awarding certain amounts to incumbents? So that's your allocation rules. There's payment rules, which is given the bids are X, Y, and Z. Are they going to pay X, Y, and Z? Now, historically in procurement, it's been a very simple payment rule. They charge you their bid amount, right? So it's always a first price mechanism. What I'm saying today is that's going to change in a world of bot-to-bot negotiations, and we've already seen evidence of those changes for over 10 years. Google were actually among one of the first large firms to apply second price auctions, and this is in how they sell keywords in sponsored search results. So of all the tens of billions Google are earning every year, they're running auctions for selling keywords, and somebody's bidding $50 for someone to click on an ad for lawyers in Chicago. They're bidding $50, but they might be paying $45 per click because the second price bidder has bid $45. That gives that payment rule gives the bidders an incentive to say $50 is my walk-away price. I don't need to come back to this site every day changing my bid depending on how others are changing their bid. Their dominant strategy equilibrium is just bid their walk-away price. So it simplifies bidding for the participants in Google's AdWords auctions. Now, in a world of sourcing bots, you want to start simplifying the dominant strategy equilibrium for your suppliers. So the easiest bidder bot to provide your suppliers with is one where the dominant strategy equilibrium is for them to just list their walk-away price. But for you to engineer that outcome and simplicity for them, and in other words, full participation from your suppliers, you've got to be prepared to change the payment rule. The habit of decades in procurement has been first price payment rule. Got to change that. So that's, and it gets back to dominant strategy equilibrium. So I won't dwell on this, but the point of this slide is that game theory has been around forever, and the first recorded act of strategizing in an auction, it was from the diary of Samuel Pepys in 1662 or something. So they were selling ships. So the Admiralty in England, after a war, they'd have all these ships and they'd want to sell them to merchants, and they'd run an auction that have. It might even be a multi-lot auction. So they have 3 candles in parallel, and when the candle burnt out, the auction was over. Somebody noticed that, this is bid sniping, some really smart bidder noticed that just before the candle goes out, the smoke that's above the candle would sink down an inch. So they had extra information that the others didn't, and they were able to say, yeah, I'll bid X, and the candle's gone. And nobody was able to respond to their bid. So when eBay started selling items and eBay took off, soon after eBay took off, people were bidding it could be for a bicycle or a car or whatever they're trying to buy, and they kept losing out in the auction in the last second, and people couldn't understand why is somebody always, how do the others get their bid in 1 millisecond just before the auction closes? Well, this is the modern day equivalent of the guy who spotted the candle and the smoke descending above a candle. There's hundreds of these bid sniper tools. So you want to say, this is the maximum I'm willing to go to, but wait to bid till the very last millisecond. So don't give our opponents a chance to respond to our bid. That's what bid sniping is all about. Now, I'd like to cover the limitations of game theory, because I don't see there's all these people who and there's a whole raft, there's a mini industry emerging around advocating game theory is a magical solution for procurement's needs. It's important, but it has its limitations, and so it's important when to know when to use it and when not to use it. So it assumes players are rational. There's lots of situations where there's all sorts of things like spite and all these psychological and emotionally driven decisions that undermine any mathematical model. It's how do you predict the outcome in an event where someone is driven by just beating that guy I really hate over there, and you can't predict it because it's not rational. So imperfect information. So in settings where the suppliers don't know much about each other's payoff structures, it's hard. The more uncertainty there is in a game, the more a game theoretic model starts to break down and just be too inaccurate to be useful. But the reason this is changing is that when you're setting up sourcing bots to automate sourcing, a natural next step is going to be bidder bots, right? So this coming quickly down the tracks, and bidder bots can actually be much simpler systems to implement if, on the sourcing side, you start applying algorithmic mechanism design. And a key thing that algorithmic mechanism design will be working toward, I suppose a key thing that large buying organizations need to accept is that the payment rule needs to change. If you approach algorithmic mechanism design and by constraining a sourcing bot to say, sorry, we have to do first price mechanisms, you're greatly limiting the scope of what you can achieve. There needs to be a change, just as Google's first ad auctions were not second price auctions. Their first efforts were first price auction. They were failing. They were failing badly because suppliers felt that bidders were compelled to come back each day to look at what their opponents were bidding and try and beat them by a small amount. So the overheads associated with bidding on potentially hundreds of keywords meant people were saying, no, forget it. So Yahoo stuck with that strategy. Google moved to second price. They actually copied AltaVista, so they didn't burnt here. So they didn't invent it, but they adopted AltaVista's approach and executed it much better. And because they had a better search engine, all of Yahoo's traffic moved over to Google. Google's revenue soared. They were able to invest more in all of the other products surrounding their search engine, and they established a position of strength. But it all came back to Halvarian's algorithmic mechanism design. That wasn't particularly it didn't need to be particularly complicated. In fact, when I was a PhD student, he was presenting it for the first time at a conference, and it was, I think, a 3-page paper. You know, it was short and sweet. In a world of sourcing bots talking to bidder bots, you start to have to encode your strategy. So what is your sourcing strategy? So when you're encoding a strategy, this is going to be used thousands of times, and even for small, medium, potentially even large events. Then you have to take a scientific approach to what is a good strategy, what is a good sourcing strategy. So game theory is the best methodology we have for understanding what would be a successful strategy. It's the only one we have for analyzing strategic interaction. So it's the one we have to work with, given all of the limitations around irrational players and so on. But you can be less worried about irrational behavior in sourcing environments where it's machines that are responding to your machines, because none of your suppliers are going to start encoding spiteful or irrational bidding behavior in bidder bots. It's not going to happen. So you can actually start to rely on more rational decision making when they're encoding their responses to your mechanisms. So that's why algorithmic mechanism design is going to be a very important technique for large businesses to apply at scale. So yeah, I think I've spoken about much of this already. So, and about the need for truth telling, right? So, these second price auction mechanisms, they're known as truthful mechanisms. That there is a famous result in mechanism design known as the revelation principle, and that's if you want to achieve an optimal mechanism. What is the optimal mechanism given your whether your objectives are cost minimization or budget balance or social welfare maximization. Governments might be interested in not cost minimization but maximizing social welfare. So if you're trying to run an auction mechanism to buy broadband for a large population, you're not necessarily looking at cost minimization, you might be looking at welfare maximization. So but the revelation principle tells us whatever your objective is, and these are it's all businesses in the room, it's generally around cost minimization. You can restrict your attention solely to truth-telling auction mechanisms. So these are mechanisms that incentivize a bidding strategy from your suppliers that says, this is my walk-away price. And they don't have to think about it anymore, right? So the dominant strategy, Nash Equilibrium, we saw the first game illustrated there, where the strategy was simple, because you can engineer mechanisms where there's a very simple strategy for them to apply. Now, and you might say, oh, is that going to be problematic? Well, it's not it's never been problematic, let's say, in Google's case, or in past examples where like Amazon use it all the time, because you are learning about the absolute walk-away price, but your suppliers will be giving it voluntarily on the basis that you're applying a payment scheme that says, well, we're going to pay you based on the next best. So, and obviously there's more complex mechanisms that introduce qualitative factors. It doesn't need to be solely price-driven by any means. So just to give you an example again from Google's ad auctions, if you were a lawyer in Chicago and you're bidding on those ads, but you're actually based in San Francisco and you just had a small practice in Chicago, and people weren't clicking on the ad, and they were clicking on the second placed ad. So Google would quickly learn, and there's a machine learning, that the income they're receiving from the second placed ad was higher. So their position auction would position the second ad above the first ad, even though their bid amount was lower. So they'd use a more complex multiplier of interest levels among viewers times the bid amount. So, and likewise in sourcing, your mechanism will use a combination of price and non-price attributes to, question.
So obviously the truth telling, getting a component is interesting, but it also, I think, relies a lot on trust.
Yes.
And I think, unfortunately, we see a lot of procurement people not being able to honor some of the trusted information they receive from suppliers.
Yeah.
Don't you see that you have a third party that kind of governs that game, and that you don't have to rely on procurement being honest or the other way around with suppliers?
If there isn't that trust, then they will lose business. So that's the when truth telling is a dominant strategy in Nash Equilibrium, you're actually you're taking an approach that bidders should be quite appreciative of, because they tend to be, and this is kind of an experience that they may be coming from a historical period of distrust, but when you're changing the rules to say we're trying to be fair here, when you're applying sourcing automation, it's usually at scale. So there's thousands of potential sourcing events. People won't be, just as there's nobody looking at Google's auctions on a one-to-one. They're not looking at what's happening in lawyers in Chicago auction. Nobody's monitoring that on a day-to-day basis. You're moving to a setting where you're going to have fewer people looking at dashboards for many more sourcing events that are occurring, but not diving in to understand what is supplier X bidding in terms of part number Y. So there's a change in approach, and there's going to be less of that human-to-human interaction, and it's going to be machine-to-machine interaction. So, and they can encode whatever strategy they like. If they feel that they don't want to disclose information and they don't want to disclose their walkaway price, they can quote a higher price, but they'll probably start losing business, and then they'll review their strategy. Then they'll revert to quoting their walkaway price. So that's how, and just as if you play that game with the dominant strategy Nash Equilibrium, if you play that a few times, people evolve towards the dominant strategy Nash Equilibrium very quickly, and that's what would happen.